Good evening, everyone. We'd like to get ourselves underway. Thank you for your attention. Very soon, our guest of honor, Dr. Hanson, will give his lecture on the Second World Wars, and our topic this evening, of course, then, is dealing with military history. And it seems that it would be entirely fitting to acknowledge that among us we probably have a number of people who have served in arms for our country, and I would ask all the veterans in the room to stand and be recognized. Thank you. Our speaker this night will be introduced by the president of the college, Dr. Larry P. Arnn, who was the 12th president of Hillsdale College. Dr. Arnn received his bachelor's degree from Arkansas State University and his MA and PhD degrees in government from the Claremont Graduate School. He served as director of research for Sir Martin Gilbert, the official biographer of Winston Churchill. Dr. Arnn served as president of the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy from 1985 to 2000. In 1996, he was the founding chairman of the California Civil Rights Initiative, which was passed by California voters and prohibited racial preferences in state hiring, contracting, and admissions. Dr. Arnn is on the board of directors of the Heritage Foundation, the Henry Salvatori Center of Claremont McKenna College, the Philadelphia Society, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and the Claremont Institute. He served on the U.S. Army War College Board of Visitors for 2 years, for which he earned the Department of Army's Outstanding Civilian Service Medal. In 2015, Dr. Arnn received the Bradley Prize from the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation. He is a member of the American Political Science Association, the Churchill Center, the Council for National Policy, the Federalist Society, the Mont Pelerin Society, and the Philanthropy Roundtable. Published widely in newspapers, magazines, and periodicals on issues of public policy, history, and political theory, he is the author of 3 books: Liberty and Learning, The Evolution of American Education, The Founder's Key, The Divine and Natural Connection Between the Declaration and the Constitution and What We Risk by Losing It, and Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill and the Salvation of Free Government. Dr. Arnn is a professor of politics and history here at Hillsdale College. He teaches courses on Aristotle, Winston Churchill, and the American Constitution. He and his wife Penelope have 4 children: Henry, Katie, Alice, and Tony. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Larry Arnn.
An exaggeration to say it, but I am Mark Kaltoff's boss. Mark is one of our senior professors, and I'm grateful to him for his fabulous work. He's a dutiful department chairman, and he makes his department behave, which is something almost nobody else around here achieves. Thank all of you for coming. I want to recognize, because he's a friend of mine, and because I don't see him as much as I like, Dave Leffler is here tonight, and Kathy's still married to him. Nobody understands that. Congratulations, Dave. Our trustee, Gunnar Klar, is here. He's married to Louise, who's from the Searle family that gave us this room. And I just found out that Gunnar sells beef to another special guest I'm going to introduce, John Harris, in just a minute. And we've just organized a deal. I bought a bunch of cattle from these guys, and I need volunteers from the students. Next summer, we're going to have a cattle drive from California to Michigan. I don't think we'll get here with any cattle, but wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't you like to do that? Yeah, see? It was all girls that were clapping, too. I give a special welcome to John and Carol Harris from near Fresno, California, where they're farmers and ranchers on a big scale. The famous Harris Ranch, that if you live in California, as I did for a long time, everybody knows about that, but everybody knows about it all over. And they're good friends of our speaker tonight, Victor Hanson. Victor himself is a fifth-generation farmer from Selma, where they have a big installation in their beef business. And they're just as solid as the land they farm, as is Victor. And I just want to welcome them and say how proud we are to have them here tonight. Thank you for coming. Victor Hanson has been a distinguished fellow here since 2004. He teaches every fall. He's a born teacher because of some qualities he has that I'll mention. He's teaching a class this term on the nature of war. And if you eat in the dining hall when you're in town, as I do, you'll find out that his course, when it's going on, is always one of the talking points of the campus. Everybody talks about it. Everybody tries to use my influence to get into Victor Hanson's class. I'm powerful, but maybe not that much. He built a classics program at Fresno State. He's taught at Stanford and the Naval Academy and Santa Cruz and Pepperdine and all over the place. Oh, I meant to mention, because I forgot, William Bordeaux, who works for John Harris, is over there, and he's sending his kids to Hillsdale College. And Don Meyer, a colleague from California, is here, and we're glad to have all those Californians. Victor is the Martin and Illy Anderson Senior Fellow at Hoover. He won the Bradley Prize, and he's the trustee of the Bradley Foundation. He won the Eric Brindell Prize, the Nimitz Leadership Award in Military History, the National Humanities Medal given by George W. Bush, President, the William F. Buckley Prize, and the Statesmanship Award of the Claremont Institute. He won all the prizes. He's written or edited 24 books, and they are consistently works of scholarship and also inspiration. I myself read them all. The newest one is entitled The Second World Wars. I've heard him lecture on that subject twice now and again tonight. I look forward to it. I always learn something, although I'm supposed to know something about that. He is one of those rare men who brings the most serious knowledge, the kind achieved only by a combination of talent and decades of devotion. But then, beyond that, he has a commanding kind of understanding. He makes complex things seem simple. He makes high things seem to be within our grasp. All who attend to him learn from him, and they are legion all over the country. This gift makes him a resource in any age, like ours especially, when things are confused and shifting and dangerous, and when everything seems new. But everything is not new. And what sureness of understanding we can achieve begins with a deep knowledge of the past and a comprehending mind that can make some sense of it. You will find, if you get to know him, what everybody does, and that is any conversation with him is fun and a way to learn. Presidents and prime ministers have enjoyed that. He is influential in the way that the wise and the knowing can be. Please welcome a great man, Victor Hanson.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think it's been 16 years since Dr. Arndt showed up in my farmhouse in Selma, California, and asked me to teach here. And I came here as a young man of 49. I was turned 64 last week, and I really feel it. But I've been very fortunate. You know, when you go to a university as a visitor, usually it's very territorial. But when I came to Hillsdale, people in my field of classics, Professor Paulvey, and Tom Connor, Mark Calcott, they were welcoming. They wanted me to teach in their field. That was very unusual. And so I felt like I was in a special place. So for the last 14 years, 1 month of my life is just completely schizophrenic. I'm in here the way America should work, and I'm leaving a place that I dearly love where America doesn't work, California. But it's been a schizophrenic experience. It's almost as bad as living in the San Joaquin Valley and then working at Stanford, where you go from somewhat stability into lunacy. And I don't know which one you're going to count as lunatic or stable, but they're very different. I'd like also to thank John and Carol Harris that came. I grew up obviously on a farm, and the Harris name in California agriculture is sort of like Hillsdale's name in education. It's synonymous with integrity and respect for the law, and it has a reputation that transcends business success. It's really unusual. So when they came, I was very thankful for that. I'd like to talk about a book I've written on World War II that's coming out on October 17th called The Second World Wars, plural. But before I get to that, I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and I want to ask, because I know there's veterans here, and I'll open it up for questions. But the thing that strikes one about World War II is it was the most lethal period of 6 years in the history of civilization. More deadly than the 6 years of the bubonic or Black Plague of the 14th century. More deadly than World War I. More deadly than the Civil War. More deadly than any 6-year period in history. There were greater body counts by Stalin and Mao, of course, but it took them longer. So why was it so deadly? 27,000 people died every year of the 6 years of World War II, from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. Think of that. It's absolutely astounding. One way to look at the war, if you step back from it, is it was a war against the unarmed. So of the 60 to 65 million people who died in this 6-year period, 80% were not combatants. That had never happened in history. It was the first major war in which the civilian toll was much greater than the combatant toll. So we want to know what happened. Why was it so lethal? Well, ostensibly, we could reduce World War II even further and say it was basically a story of Germans and Japanese killing people who didn't have weapons. And that's the story of World War II. 27 million people in the Soviet Union were killed by the Wehrmacht, and another 5 million in Eastern Europe. And Japan killed about 3 million people in Asia and the Pacific, and 17 million Chinese. Take that away, and World War II is not that unusual. That's important to remember in the context of the war, because we are so obsessed in our generation with Hiroshima or the bombing of Dresden or the bombing of Hamburg, and we forget that World War II was a story of Germans and Japanese killing people who had no weapons. Why was it so lethal, though? Aside from the civilian toll, why was it so lethal in a way that the other wars had not been? One of them was the world had never been more populated by 1939. There were 2 billion people living, so there were more people living and more people to die. The second was that there was not just nationalism or territorial chauvinism or even ethnic chauvinism, but there was an ideology. And by that I mean that Italian fascism made Italy do things in Libya and Somalia that it did not do in World War I. And Nazism or National Socialism made the German army do things, and the German Third Reich do things that even it had not considered under the worst moments of Prussian militarism. And it made Japanese nationalism, fascism in Japan, do things that it had not done in the the Japanese-Russian War of 1905 and 6. Take those players away from World War II, and you have a war, and the Soviet Union as well. The Soviet army committed atrocities, killed 2 million German prisoners, not as much as they lost, 5 million. The Nazis killed Russian prisoners, but they did things that the Tsarist army had never done. Take those ideologies out of the equation, and it was a pretty humane war if you look at what the American army and the British army did in comparison. But add fascism and communism and Nazism into the mix, and a lot of people being alive at that time, and people not being prepared for the advent of fascism in Russia and China, and you have the ingredients for 65 million dead. One final thing to remember is this was at a peak of Western technology that the world had never seen, and more importantly, we all have Western technology that has challenge, response, challenge. You have catapults, you build walls. You build bigger catapults, bigger walls. You have armor on a knight, then you can't penetrate, you get a crossbow. But at this particular cycle, the offensive was predominant. By that I mean the war started with biplanes, it ended with jets. It started with World War I artillery shells, it ended with proximity fuses, V-1 and V-2 rockets. It started with the knowledge of chlorine gas was used by the Japanese but not in Europe, and it ended with Zyklon B and the death camps. So the technological fury of 20th century technology explains a lot, and the fact that we were in an offensive cycle. We're sort of in a defensive cycle today where we have missile defense, we have the ability to shoot down incoming planes, we have body armor. All that in this particular cycle was not there. So it was much easier to kill people en masse in World War II, technologically, ideologically, politically, than it had ever been at any time. When I say Second World Wars, I refer just really quickly to two things. When the war started on September 1st, when Germany invaded Poland, followed 3 weeks later by the Russian Soviet invasion of Poland, people still referred to World War I, or what the British call the First World War, as the Great War. Nobody had envisioned this as any other thing than an intensive version of what Nazis do all the time in the last decade. They had gone and militarized the Rhineland. They had sort of stepped over the bounds a little bit in the Saarland plebiscite. They had the Anschluss, which was forbidden in Versailles. They had destroyed Czechoslovakia, and they went into Poland. This time, Hitler didn't believe that they would be declared war on by France and Britain. They did, but nothing really happened. So Hitler thought this is just another border war. And he prepared the Third Reich for that purpose. And what followed Poland, of course, was the destruction of Denmark, the destruction of Norway, later the destruction of the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, France, and by April of 1941, Yugoslavia and Greece, and the Blitz against Britain. But all of these had something in common. They were all border wars or wars against neighbors. And for that, the fascist powers had been preparing for a decade nearly, and the Allied powers had not. What do I mean by that? I mean, empirically, if you look at the German army, 75% of it was still horse-powered. They were not so worried about gasoline for their panzers, they were more worried about pasturage and hay for their horses. The tanks that went into Poland had a 20-millimeter gun. The planes that flew, Stuka, the dreaded Stukas, were obsolete within a year. What I'm trying to suggest is these were a series of border war, we could even call them bully wars, until they did two things that they had not anticipated. They had declared war in Britain, and they had no strategic method to defeat Britain. Think of that. You declare war on an enemy, and you have no means to limit their production. By that I mean the British Navy was the largest navy in the world. Germany was not even a close 7th or 8th. They had no aircraft carriers. They were outnumbered in destroyers, cruisers, battleships. They had no means to achieve naval superiority. They could not invade Britain. They could not cut Britain off by sea, even though they had a very successful U-boat. They could not bomb Britain. They had no idea that in the worst moment of the Blitz, Winston Churchill was producing more airframes of Spitfire Supermarine fighters than were Me-109s. Think of that. The present EU, all under the control of one government, all the way from the English Channel to the borders with Russia, and Little Britain was producing more Spitfires than the Germans were producing 109s. So they had no conception of who the British were, and they hit an obstacle. The second thing that this sort of border wars found is they invaded the Soviet Union, and that changed everything and changed the Second World Wars into a global war, because for the first time the Wehrmacht was not fighting someone next to their borders, fighting someone they outnumbered, and fighting someone that was clearly technologically inferior. They were fighting an army that was 3 times their size and had plans for a T-34 tank that was better than anything that they had and could be supplied generously by the British Empire and the United States by naval convoys, and the Germans had no way to deflect it. That process then changed border wars that were all had certain things in common. The German army fought people nearby. They fought them through surprise, and they had easy logistics, and they were numerically or they were militarily unprepared. And then they found out that Britain didn't quite fit that bill, the Soviet Union didn't quite fit that bill, and by December 7th, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the United States didn't fit that bill. Then they got into a global war that they could not win. And I'd like to walk us through that process very quickly, but one other reason that I used the plural was that this was the first war that was almost unconnected. There were 2 billion people on the planet, and 1 billion people were actively engaged in the war, either fighting it or preparing to fight it industrially or in manufacturing. By the time the war ended, there was only about 8 nations that had not declared war on one of the 2 sides. But if you were in a U-boat in the North Atlantic, you had no experience of what a combatant was doing in the jungles of Guadalcanal. If you were 25,000 feet up in a B-29 over the Marianas taking off, you had no idea what Rommel's panzers were doing in North Africa. And it wasn't just that their theaters were so diverse, but the mechanisms and the methodology of fighting. You could be in a tank, you could be on the ground, you could be in artillery, you could be in a heavy cruiser, you could be in a high bomber. This had never really happened before. Most wars, the Civil War or First World War, were one-dimensional. There had been U-boats in the World War I, but they were not three-dimensional, or maybe even four-dimensional, fighting on the surface, fighting below the surface, fighting on land, fighting on the air. And so it was so complicated and complex that people didn't know really what to call it. Once Germany invaded Russia, then the idea of border wars disappeared, and now we were in World War II. In the Anglosphere, we call it the Second World War, and we went back and renamed the First World War, not as the Great War, but World War I or the First World War. So what happened? Why did Germany and Japan and Italy go to war? Because Germany had won these border wars, and it had a numerical superiority over Britain. Maybe not the British Empire, but in 1941, by May, there were 80 million Germans and there was only 45 million Britons, and that was all that was left. There was no other major power fighting the Third Reich or Italy except Britain, and they were outnumbered 2-1. And yet in 6 months, Hitler managed to change that equation, that even with the addition of 78 million Japanese, he was going to be outnumbered 2-1. So he went from outnumbering his enemy 2-1 to being outnumbered 2-1 once he brought in 300 million Russians and Americans into the fabric. So why would he do such a stupid thing? When you ask why people start wars, there's always the superficial reason, what started the fighting and why did somebody existentially or theoretically wanted to go to war. Well, Hitler went into Poland and he went into these countries and he went into the Soviet Union because no one had stopped him. He felt that the United States was isolationist. Britain had been appeasing in prior governments prior to Churchill, the Soviet Union to be colluding. He didn't think anybody would really want to expend treasure and blood to stop him, or if they did, they had seen what he had done against weaker powers and they were intimidated. He was quite right. People in the United States, Charles Lindbergh, people in the Soviet Union said Stalin went in some type of catatonic fit for 2 weeks. People really did believe that the Wehrmacht was unstoppable. They were not empirical. They did not measure actually the size of the army, the equipment of the army, and compare it to the resources that he was up against. So what I'm saying is that Hitler was crazy to do such a thing, to bring in 200, 300 million people, the largest economy in the world, the United States. And remember, within 5 years, the U.S. GDP will be larger than all of the 6 major belligerents together. And yet he declared war on us on December 11th. So why would he do such a thing? These countries lost deterrence, but more importantly, In the last 20 years, the German people had believed that as losers of World War I, they had been cheated of a victory because they had surrendered 70 miles in Belgium and France. And almost immediately, when the army came back, they said this was an armistice. This was not an unconditional surrender. We were stabbed in the back by Jews and communists. We could have won. We knocked out Tsarist Russia. They capitulated. We annexed 50 million people and 1 million square miles. We had a treaty with them, the Brest-Litovsk. And yet we lost the war. We shouldn't have lost the war. And then when they signed the Versailles Treaty, they had the worst combination a treaty could imagine. It was punitive and humiliating and weak. It put war guilt on Germany. It made them pay reparations. And yet it didn't occupy Germany as we did in World War II. We had no mechanism to enforce the Versailles Treaty, and very quickly the Germans sized up the Allies that in their victory they were depressed, and in their defeat the Germans were confident. So if you read war poetry in between the wars, or you look at French textbooks, the message is we never want another Somme. We never want another Verdun. If you look what Germany is doing at the same time, we want another Verdun and we want another Somme, because this time we're going to win. And yet only one person knew that. It was Winston Churchill, the only country that was left before the Third Reich went into the Soviet Union. So after this war started, and Japan also had sensed that the United States had lost deterrence. It did something equally foolish. It had the third largest navy in the world, but we were second. But what they didn't realize, or they did realize, is we were second, but we would be the largest navy in the world within 12 months, and within 24 months we would have a navy that was larger than every other navy in the world combined. We had on order 7 battleships, 60 destroyers, 100 submarines, and most importantly 27 Essex carriers, and with light and escort we would build 145 aircraft carriers. And yet they attacked a country of that magnitude. Why? Because they felt that we either would not fight, or if we fought, we would fight half-heartedly. They said in Japanese memos and communications, they said, well, their closest friend was Britain. They just watched it be bombed. They didn't lift a finger. They just barely had a draft by 1 vote. Half their fleet's in Europe. They're not serious. And people in the Japanese War Department said, just don't touch Pearl Harbor, and take the Dutch East Indies. Holland doesn't exist. Take Southeast Asia. France doesn't exist anymore. You can have everything you want, just don't touch the United States at Pearl Harbor in the Philippines. And the Japanese war minister said, why? They don't want to fight. And sane voices in Japan said, well, you have no ability, just like Germany has no ability. Germany has no ability to go to Moscow. They don't have the logistical capability. They have no ability to bomb Britain. And you have no ability to bomb San Diego, much less a place like Detroit. And yet you're declaring war on a country that you cannot defeat. But again, they thought that we had lost deterrence and that we wouldn't react in the way we did, or if we wanted to react in the way we did, we wouldn't have the capability because we hadn't shown that in the 1930s. So the war basically was a story. Once Germany and Italy had declared war on us 4 days after Pearl Harbor, it was a simple story of, will the Allies, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and Great Britain, will they be able to fight like Axis soldiers? Will they be as deadly as the deadly Japanese, and will they be as deadly as German soldiers? Or will German and Japanese economies be able to produce as many war materials and weapons as the Allies? So what we had to do was, we had the industrial ability, but we didn't know. We had the 17th largest army in the world. And the Soviets had been very, very poorly performing in Finland. They had been late when they invaded Poland. They hadn't done well when they sent advisors to the Spanish Civil War. Britain seemed like it was half-hearted. They were still had a standoff. At Dunkirk, they had to evacuate. So the question was, the Axis said, well, they can't fight like we do, but we can learn to produce like they do. And in fact, the exact opposite happened. The United States, as you know, from Guadalcanal, as early as November of 1942, American members of the 1st Marine Division were as deadly as Japanese, without any more material support. British soldiers fought as well as Rommel in North Africa. Soviet Union, the Red Army, within a year was as deadly or more deadly than the Wehrmacht. It didn't seem that that was foreordained. If we had taken a date in late 1942, the mad designs of Hitler and Tojo almost seemed to bear fruition. They thought, you know what, they haven't really geared up yet. We've been in the war almost a year. And if you looked over the map, Hitler would say, we're 100 miles from Grozny and all of the Caspian oil that supplies the Soviet Union. Our soldiers have just climbed Mount Erebus in the Caucasus Mountain, highest mountain in Europe. We own territory from the Volga River to the English Channel, from Norway and the Arctic Circle all the way to the Sahara Desert. We're almost surrounded, we're still surrounding Moscow. We blockaded Leningrad, we've taken Kiev. Rommel has just accepted the British surrender in June 23rd at Tobruk. The Americans have lost the Philippines, the British have lost Singapore. The Japanese have now destroyed, in a series of devastating, this is after the Battle of Midway, devastating sea battles off Guadalcanal. They have destroyed every single carrier in the Pacific except the crippled Enterprise. And now they are on the offensive at Guadalcanal, and if they take Guadalcanal, they've cut off the lifeline to Australia. So it looked like that we had not been able to fight like they are, and we hadn't really geared up yet, but they were producing material like we were. And then it all vanished within 6 months. Americans became, British became, Russians became much more skillful soldiers. The United States didn't produce 30,000 airframes, 40,000 airframes. It produced 100,000 airframes per year. It didn't produce 20 or 30,000. It produced 55,000 Sherman tanks. Soviet Union produced 60,000 Stalin and T-34 tanks. We supplied 2,000 locomotives to the Soviet Union, 400,000 heavy trucks, a type of production that nobody had ever seen before. Everybody had said, Roosevelt's a socialist. He's a central planner. Nobody thought he would turn over the war effort to people like William Knudsen and Charles Wilson, some of the most brilliant people at General Electric, General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford, producing a V-24 every hour 30 miles from here at Willow Run. And so we overwhelmed the Axis in an amazing time of less than 4 years. Nobody had ever thought that would be possible. And we did it in a combination of economic superiority, but we learned to fight in a way that was much better. There were 3 or 4 other things that explain why this war, which could have gone on for 20 years, 27 in the Peloponnesian War's cases, it could have gone on longer, but it didn't. Another reason that it was very short, and I'm hesitant to use the word short because, as I said, 60 million people were killed, but the Allies were very diverse politically. There was communist Russia, democratic Americans, parliamentary and monarchical Britain with an empire. You think they would not get along. On the other hand, there was fascist Italy, fascist Germany, and fascist Japanese. They would all coordinate. Just the opposite happened. Something about the nature of fascism that was inherent in lying was inherent in fascism, double dealing. So when Hitler went into the Soviet Union, Italy had no idea they invaded. Japan said, my gosh, they're going to invade the Soviet Union. We fought them in 1939. We're going to conclude a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Hitler said, you can't do that, we're going to invade. And they said, you did it to us when we were fighting. And then Hitler said, well, don't get mad at me for going to the Soviet Union. You never told us you were going into Greece. And yet, because there were at least 2 of 3 partners on the Allied side that were transparent and consensual, those governments, as early as Casablanca, basically figured out a way to cooperate. For all the evil of the Soviet Union, there was only one Soviet Union, not 3. So the Allies were able to task out jobs. They said to the Soviet Union, your job is to destroy the Wehrmacht on the land. And indeed they did. 75% of all soldiers in the German army were killed by Russians. Their job was not, and they said to the Allies, you do not have to fight in Italy, you do not have to fight in North Africa, you do not have to stop the U-boat campaign, you do not have to fight the Japanese, you don't have to do strategic bombing. Just fight. We will give you boots, we will give you radios, we will give you food, we'll give you uniforms, we'll give you truck, we will mechanize, but just destroy the German army on the Eastern Front. And the British and the Americans will handle the Japanese, they will handle strategic bombing, and there was a very sophisticated outsourcing of tasks in the ways that the Axis never cooperated. The Axis had very good airplanes. If the Japanese had just got the plans earlier of a 262 MiG, of a Messerschmitt, if they had just been able to deal with the Germans on the Focke-Wulf 190 engine, if the Italians could have just borrowed some early Mark III designs of surplus German tanks, they would have been okay. There was no such cooperation. When the Sherman tank met the Tiger tank in 1944 in Normandy, the British said, the great tank, it's reliable, it's pragmatic, it's durable, but it's under gun. So we have a 17-pounder. We think we can put that huge barrel in your tank. When we had a P-51, it was the best aerodynamic fighter in the world, but it had an Allison engine. The British said, we have a Merlin Rolls-Royce engine. Such cooperation would be unheard of with the Axis. Hitler would have said, let's steal it, or don't give them the designs. The British said, here's the designs for the Merlin engine. You can make it in the United States. And it upped the speed by 75 miles an hour. It made the best fighter in the world. That was very important that there was this cooperation. There was another thing as well that was quite different from the two sides that explains this inexplicable victory so quickly, that the bullies lost, and as I said, once the war got global, they lost in 4 years. And another reason was the attitude toward war production. The fascist powers had a 19th century idea that morale, elan, battlefield prowess would trump logistics, materiel, and there's something to that, as you know, through military history. But the Allies were far more pragmatic. So if you wanted a tank, the Germans said, well, a Sherman tank is not very good. We met it. It's got a 75 millimeter, even a 76 millimeter gun can't penetrate either a Panther or a Tiger. It's only got 3 inches of armor. Ours have 6. We can blow them apart at 2 miles away. And the Americans said, in answer to this, maybe so, but not if there's 1 Tiger or 1 Panther on the battlefield for every 6 Shermans. And you just bypass a German tank and let the Air Force deal with it, and you attack infantry that have no tanks. Or they said, well, we have to go 3,000 miles, so we have to pick up a tank on a crane and put it in a ship. It'd be nice to have a 60 or 70-ton King Tiger, but what would we do with them? We couldn't even pick them up and put them on ships. They wouldn't fit. And then they said, the designers of the Sherman tank, we've got a Chrysler engine. You can go 10 hours for 1 hour of maintenance. Tiger tank can go 1 hour for 1 hour of maintenance. You can take out a Sherman transmission in 3 hours. You have to take the Tiger tank's transmission from the Ukraine and put it on a rail and send it back to the factory, Porsche factory in Germany. So there was this idea that we're going to be practical. We don't have to build the best weapons. They have to be reliable and they have to be durable. And integral to this philosophy is we're not going to be addicted to the idea of gigantism. That's the age-old idea that a weapon is good if it's big. Sort of like Demetrius the Besieger built this huge Heliopolis to take Rhodes. Took so much capital and labor and it fell over. And that's what the Japanese did. They said, we have the largest battleships in the world, the Yamato and the Musashi, 71,000 tons. They were the largest warships until the 1960s when U.S. aircraft carrier exceeded that tonnage. Those two ships together sunk one of 145 American carriers. That's all they did in the entire war. They call it the Hotel Musashi because it was so expensive to get out of port. It had an 18-inch gun. It could fire 27 miles, but Americans could blow it up at sea very easy with a carrier, and that's what happened to both of them. The Bismarck and the Tirpitz were wonderful ships. In fact, in an old-fashioned battle, as you know, the Bismarck blew up the hood and disabled the Prince of Wales, and that was it. It was quickly sunk. The Tirpitz, the most expensive ship that Germany ever built, they could have built 25 destroyers or 30 U-boats or 5,000 priceless 88 millimeter anti-tank guns, and yet they built the Tirpitz, and it fired one salvo in anger the entire war. They had a weapons program that was the most expensive, we thought, $1 billion in dollars, the V-2 and the V-1 rocket programs. V-1 was a simple cruise missile. V-2 was basically an intercontinental missile. Those together terrified Britain. They killed 11,000 Britons, the two programs together. But the cost to deliver a pound of explosive was 30 times more expensive than a lumbering Lancaster or B-17. We burned down the cities of Japan and Germany very cheaply, if you can be so grotesque, and they spent all their money dreaming of a vengeance weapon that did almost no value at all. We had $2 billion weapons programs. The B-29 program, in 14 months we built a bomber. It had 20,000 rivets in the cone alone. It had over 150,000 parts. It was the most complex bomber in the world. But it destroyed 65% of the urban core of Japan in 4 months. And we had a Manhattan project that after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, along with the bombing, it forced Japan to surrender. So our idea of weapons programs and spending large amounts of capital were not in obsolete dinosaurs that were battleships or rail guns. Germans had 7,500 men manning a Gustav rail gun that shot a 400 millimeter projectile into Sevastopol, and it could do that about 120 times, and you had to change the barrel. Finally, they were of no value. They represented about 7,000 88 millimeter platforms that were not built. So that American practicality and British practicality, even Soviet, was much different than the world of fantasy that Mussolini, Tojo, and Hitler lived in. That too was a reason that the war ended as quickly as it did. And finally, you could argue that the German and Japanese generals, General Hama or Yamaguchi or von Bock or von Rundstedt or Guderian or Rommel, were comparable to Patton, comparable to LeMay, comparable maybe to Nimitz and Halsey, and you can make that argument. But you cannot argue that Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo had the strategic knowledge that Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill did. The big three did not do things like invade China and find themselves in a quagmire of 12 years that would eat up 1 million soldiers. They did not in 1944, when they were losing the war, invade Burma and try to go into India. They did not do something stupid like invade the Soviet Union without any knowledge that there was such a thing as a T-34 coming off. They did stupid things. They lost Tobruk, they lost Singapore, they lost Corregidor, but these were all manageable and correctable. They did not, and why didn't they do it? Because Roosevelt and Churchill did not say, I want to do this. If Churchill said, I want to go in something stupid, and I want to go into Rhodes, or I want to attack the Ionian Islands, people in a consensual society said, don't, and they hashed it out. When Hitler said, I want to go in the Soviet Union, you should read the minutes from the Wehrmacht's OKW. Don't do it. But they didn't tell him that. He could do whatever he wanted. So they had a mythic leadership that was nursed on these cheap, easy victories of the mid-1930s against underpowered and unprepared enemies. And they translated that into wrongly concluding that they were actually a formidable power. And they went to war against the three most powerful countries in the world, and they lost. And it was quite predictable after 1941. Let me just finish by asking ourselves, did World War II achieve anything? And the answer, of course, is yes. The aim of World War II was to stop the horrific governments in Italy, Japan, and fascist Germany, Nazi Germany. It did that. Late, but it was late, but it did save half of European Jews. 6 million were killed, 6 million survived. The point was that it went into Eastern Europe to free Eastern Europe from the dangers of totalitarianism. If, however, as Franklin Roosevelt saw, as Churchill didn't, that the purpose of the war was not just to defeat these three ugly hydra heads of fascism, but to end war altogether and to have a United Nations, and under the aegis of the paternalistic United States, both tell the Soviet Union to behave and Britain to give up its empire, and then everything would be wonderful. It didn't work at all, because we went to free Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe was unfree under Soviet rather than German domination. And so if you want to be perfect, then if you define victory in war as being perfect, then you can't be good. But we fulfilled all of our aims, but if your aims are redefined as something impossible, then we felt, wow, the war didn't work because our ally, the Soviet Union, became our enemy, Germany. In conclusion, let's just finish with 5 minutes and look at the individual 6 belligerents, what happened after the war. Of the Axis power, Italy got off pretty easy. There were no war crime trials. There were no reparations. Italy was not occupied. Why was that? Well, largest foreign population in the United States who identified separately. Germans had been all assimilated and integrated. We were Italian Americans, that helped. The Pope and the Vatican helped. And the Italians threw out Mussolini, they said, on their own. And Italy was fought over for 3.5 years by Germans on behalf of Italian fascists and then against Italy. And the idea was, well, Germany only had war on its soil for 3 months. Japan never did. Italy suffered. We're going to let Italy go. Did Italy suffer? It lost 1.1 million soldiers, more than it did in World War I. It committed terrible atrocities in Somalia and Libya, and yet people said it had suffered enough. And for what it had gambled under Mussolini, it got off pretty closely. It was occupied and integrated into the Western Alliance. If you look at Japan, people think Japan was nuked. It was the only country ever to be on the receiving end of a nuclear weapon. That's true, and it's tragic. But the nuclear weapon drops at Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed about 30% of those Japanese that were killed through conventional napalming by B-29 fire rates. That total number was about 600,000 Japanese. Japan lost a total of 3 million. For a country that had started the war and made it global in December of 1941 by declaring war on the United States and Britain and had been fighting a war of genocide in China, they came off pretty easily. They were not invaded. They were occupied, but we insisted they have things that turned out quite beneficial. Land reform, the franchise for women, and we were a pretty benign occupier for a country that had killed 9 people for every person they lost. It was the most efficient killing machine in World War II. When you look at what the Japanese army did in the Pacific, not just against Americans and British, but islanders, people in Java, people in Southeast Asia and China, a Japanese soldier was the most lethal soldier in the war in terms of how many people he killed versus how many he lost. Germany, this time around after Versailles, nobody said, I don't really know who started the war, the arms merchants, maybe it was mobilizations. No, nobody said any of those stupid things. This time they said, you started the war, and we're going to occupy you, and we're going to divide your country in 4 parts, and you're not going to be able to rearm, and you're not going to be able to have a military capability comparable to your former enemies. And so we occupied the country. We put a gun to their head and said, this time you're going to have a democracy. It's not going to be like Weimar. And we're not going to do what we did at Versailles. And you know what the world said? By any objective measure, that was much tougher than the Versailles Treaty. And not a person said anything. They didn't say, you can't do that. That's meaner than Versailles. They still said Versailles was too mean, but they never said that the peace imposed on Germany after World War II that was much meaner was mean at all. Such was the anger at Germany. And so East and West Germany came out of that division. We incorporated it in NATO. and it became part of the Western Alliance. Today, we see that much weaker economies and smaller populations in France and Britain have nuclear weapons. Germany doesn't. And that's for a reason, isn't it? And I would say that one of the formulas, after looking at these Axis and Allied soldiers, one of the formulas, I want to get to the Soviets and the United States to conclude, but one of the formulas after World War II was incorporated in NATO. The way to keep the peace is not to have the United Nations necessarily, it's to keep Russia out of Europe and the United States in Europe and Germany down. And today, if you look at that formula, as long as the United States is engaged with alliances and balance of powers, it's able to preempt situations that would lead into global wars. As long as you have a country like the Soviet Union, by extension, China, that can be contained, those totalitarian or autocratic governments that have large populations and territories will not start a global war. And as long as you can have a very dynamic country like Germany with a very checkered history, you're okay. And some of you are going to say, well, I'm German-American, how can you say that? And I can say that after just coming back from Germany and the Czech Republic, I heard this from Germany's neighbors. Germany's back. They're telling everybody in Eastern Europe that we have to have an immigration, suicidal immigration, just like they do. People in Southern Europe said they're running a mercantile system where they artificially lower their Deutschmark under the guise of using the euro, and we're in hock to them the rest of their life. And people in Britain are saying they don't have to be so punitive on the Brexit. And the reason that that's not going to translate into a world war is that they're disarmed and they have two nuclear neighbors, France and Britain, that are not going to let them arm again. So that formula after World War II kept the peace, and it's a tribute to the geniuses who crafted it, Churchill and Roosevelt, especially Anthony Eden, people like George Marshall. And finally, how did the United States and the Soviet Union and Great Britain do? Soviet Union lost 27 million people, most of any country in the war. Its land was occupied, for most fertile and industrial sections were occupied for 4 years. It suffered a great deal, but it went to war so that it would never have to be vulnerable again, and that object was fulfilled. It got all of Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. It broke every agreement that it had made with the Allies about free elections in places like Poland or Hungary or Romania. It never gave the Baltic states back. It kept territory it had stolen from Finland. So in the communist way of thinking, the war to free, as I said, totalitarian control of Eastern Europe ended up guaranteeing it, and the Soviet Unions were quite happy with that. We should note in passing that of all the 6 belligerents, the Soviet Union in World War I made a deal with every other belligerent. They had cut a non-aggression pact with Germany and Italy. They had cut a non-aggression pact with Japan. They cut an alliance with the United States. They cut an alliance with Britain. And they basically broke all of their agreements with our allies that saved them, and they never broke one agreement with their Axis that tried to destroy them. They were the most duplicitous of all the powers in World War II, and they came out for all of the misery and death that they suffered. They came out in a stronger position than they had gone into the war, in which communism had been discredited. There were the great famines, the great terror, the liquidation of the officer corps, and people thought it was a reeling power. It was set to be a superpower in the Cold War. We should give more credit to Britain. Britain was the only country to fight the first day of the war, September 1st, 1939, or September 2nd when it declared, and end the last day of the war, September 2nd. It was the only country that fought Nazi Germany by itself for over a year. It was the only country that went to war in World War II without being attacked in a surprise attack by an enemy and without attacking another country. It went to war for the idea of helping Poland. And Britain, as I said, outproduced Germany in every aspect of munitions except tanks. But think of it, artillery pieces, vehicles, planes, bombers, fighters, ships. It was one of the most, we think of the United States, but given its much smaller industrial base and population, its war production was just as impressive. What happened after the war was sort of tragic, because if you look at the war and the post-war era, and you compare it today, there was no Chinese juggernaut. It was flattened. There was no Russia. It was flattened. There was no Japan. It was flattened. There was no Germany. It was flattened. There was no France. It had been occupied. There were only two countries that were going to supply the world with trucks and appliances, and they were Britain and the United States. And the tragedy is the man who'd won the war, they displaced, and they brought in a socialist government, and they nationalized their coal, their steel, their power, their health, almost everything, and within 10 years they were not as competitive as the countries that were in rubble, at least not until the resurgence of Margaret Thatcher. And finally, the United States, pretty brilliant. We had 12.1 million people in the military. We were the only country to wage a war in every single theater of World War II, whether it was Burma, whether it was high-altitude bombing over Japan, whether it was nuclear war, whatever it was we fought. We lost the smallest number of people per military soldiers deployed of any country in the entire war, 0.3%, 420,000 out of 12.1 million. So it was a brilliant effort to save lives through the use of capital and machinery. The war led to some very good things. It led to the integration of troops because we had campaigned, our propaganda said we're here to our four freedoms, and that chit had to be redeemed with the integration of blacks into the military by Korea, and women were in factories, so it had positive social effects. It gave the United States power and a role in the world that only Britain had enjoyed in the past, and you could say that Americans did not make the mistake they did after World War II. They stayed engaged and they kept a peace for 70 years. Let me just finally sum up and say, well, if all that was true, did we really have to go to the war to prove all that? And the way to look at it, I think, is that war is like a laboratory experiment. In this room, if we didn't like each other, we would know who was strong and who was weak by their size or their prior experience in fighting. But maybe we didn't, and we would say stupid things, and we would find themselves a stronger person might be angry at a weaker person. And what war then does, it's the testing ground that shows you reality. It's tragic because you shouldn't have to do that. And by that I mean the United States, with the largest economy, even in the Depression years, did not have to spend 0.5% on defense. If we had a 4% GDP and a pact with France, Germany would have said, I'm never going to go into France. They landed 2 million people in World War I. I don't want that again. And they would have stopped. If Britain had have said, we want Churchill in 1937, and he's going to give us 450 airframes a month, then we have a better plane than German, Goering would have said, I don't want to go into there. If Stalin had have said, we would have had T-34 tanks in great numbers, Hitler himself said, if I had have known how many tanks they had that were of the caliber of the T-34, I would have never gone into Russia. But people forget that. So they're nursed on ideas of utopian idealism, military spending is a waste, and they lose deterrence. And with the loss of deterrence, you lose the perception of who's strong and who's weak. And then the laboratory comes into play and says, I'll show you who's strong and weak. And 60 million people have to prove what we should have known from the very beginning of the war, that the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain were much more deadly than the fascist powers of Italy, Germany, and Japan. Thank you very much.
We now have time for a few questions. Please raise your hand and the speaker or a microphone will be brought to you.
Dr. Hanson, thank you. I'm Michael Goldstein, Ohio State Director of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations and a student of World War II. I have a question about the Japanese strategy. Before the war, their strategy was to lure the American battle fleet into the Western Pacific, pick off the battle fleet here and there with submarines and land-based naval air, and then beat them in a Jutland-style battle. That didn't come to pass. They came to Hawaii to destroy the battle fleet there. What was their thinking? Admiral Yamamoto seemed to understand that the American industrial capacity would be put to use. And the Americans they fought holding action in the Pacific, but they didn't have to come west until we had our huge battle fleet and were ready to do it. Was it just hubris, or they really thought we wouldn't fight?
Very quickly, I think Admiral Yamamoto has a very inflated reputation because basically on the premise that he said, supposedly, that I can raise hell for 6 months and after that I can't get. Whether he said that or not, we don't know, but we do know that he was the one, not the Japanese evil people we always associate with the Tojo regime, that wanted to start the war. He threatened to resign if he didn't get to attack Pearl Harbor. And he didn't have a plan to deal with the 3 carriers if they were not there, and they weren't there. He had no idea how to deal with the 27 that would soon be on order. And so he either sunk or he submerged battleships 7 that had been built in 1917, 16, 22 that were obsolete. And that's not a good way to start a war against the largest economic power. So what I'm getting at is if you ask Yamamoto today, after Pearl Harbor, what's next? He would say, well, I've crushed their battleships so they won't fight. They're humiliated the way that we did to end the Japanese-Russian war. And that's about the limit of his strategic thinking. I don't know why we ordered an assassination attempt on him in 1943 that was successful. We killed him with P-38s, long-range fighters, because if we had left him in, he would have done even stupider things. Because his strategy at Midway was absolutely insane. He split his forces up, and he had a huge advantage in carriers, cruisers, battleships, and he wasted those assets in Alaska. So he was not a strategic thinker. Sorry I went a little bit long because I did want to have more questions. Yeah.
On a similar vein, watched the movie Dunkirk the other day. Don't know if you've seen it or
yeah, I reviewed it.
What about the? I'd read that there were actually the Germans were surrounding the British and French, but just sat there for 3 days.
Yes, they did.
Because Hitler would not give them the go. What's your inclination to think about why that was done?
It depends on whether you want to hear a conspiracy theory or what happened. The conspiracy theory is that Hitler was going to stop the certain destruction of British and French forces, and as in return for that token of magnitude, Churchill was going to say, okay, we appreciate what you've done, and the British monarchy, some members of the monarchy, some aberrant members, and the aristocracy want to cut a deal. That did not happen, I think. I think much more likely is the German panzers had gone through the Ardennes, and they had been fighting for 6 weeks. We forget, we just say the fall of France, they were wiped out. Germany suffered about 200,000 casualties, and they lost somewhere between 30 to 40,000 dead and missing from the French and the British in their wonderful defeat, and they were completely exhausted. That was one reason, and they were re-equipping, and they thought that the U-boat presence and the presence of the Luftwaffe gave them superiority over the Channel, and Britain did not have the wherewithal to get the men out. So they said, we want to rest, we want to re-equip, and then they're not going to go anywhere because we have air superiority. And the British don't want to go into the waters with U-boats. And so they waited 3 days, and that turned out to be quite stupid because the British were much more resourceful than the Germans thought. And then the final thing to add to that is that Hermann Goering was not a Downey or Hap Arnold. And so he was one of the most incompetent members of the Reich, and he was a commander of the Luftwaffe, and he assured Hitler that his Luftwaffe could handle, could achieve not just air superiority, but air supremacy and wipe them out at their choosing. And he didn't realize that not only were British fighters better than the 109 with good pilots, but even French fighters were as good, some of their models. And so they fought very effectively. They took a terrible beating, but the Luftwaffe would lose over France about 1,500 fighters over the fall of France and another 1,600 over Britain, so that when they went into the Soviet Union, they were 3,000 planes short. So we talk about the Blitz or the cowardly French, but we don't realize that their contribution and air power damage to the Luftwaffe may have saved the Soviet Union. Any other questions?
A few years ago, Pat Buchanan wrote a book called The Unnecessary War.
Yes.
To the extent, I think he meant that if Hitler had been stopped sooner enough, the war would not have been fought. Do you,
Yes.
do you recognize?
Yeah, I reviewed that book as well on YouTube. Very strange YouTube. Christopher Hitchens and I were supposed to debate that book, but we ended up agreeing that this thesis was not persuasive. Because there had been a movement, it's very logical, and it said Stalin killed more people than Hitler has, and he's got a dynamic ideology that transcends race and religion, communism. Hitler's ideology is confined to Aryanism. It's not going to appeal to people in Burma or China. So let him fight it out. And then people started to suggest that the Soviet Union would probably lose, and if Germany got its hands, I don't mean that they looked at this empirically, they thought in advance. I'm not suggesting that Buchanan was wrong, that there were communist sympathizers in the State Department. There were. But the preponderance of opinion among American military minds was Germany will probably defeat the Soviet Union unless we help them. And we can give the Soviet Union areas, we can help areas that allow to free them up to do what they do well. And they do two things well. They build guns, artillery, and they build tanks. They can't make boots, they can't make radios, they can't make aluminum, they can't make locomotives. We'll do that and specialize the economy. And that will wear out the Third Reich. And that is why 27 million Russians died and 405,000 Americans and 385,000 British. So we said we're going to use Soviet manpower to blunt the Third Reich. We have to remember also at the time there had never been an army. I said that it was incompetent. Maybe it was logistically, but not the German soldier. Even on the Western Front in 1944, after they lost 3 million men, they still killed 1.5 Americans for every one they lost. And they killed 7 Soviets for every one they lost. So they were a deadly, deadly force, the German soldier, and thank God for the Red Army that dealt with them. And then we had to, not that it was such a brilliant policy afterwards, because I said we empowered the Soviet Union, but we had a bad and a worse choice, and I think we took the bad choice. Thank you. Any final question? Okay. Oh, one more? Yeah.
Within the context of Santayana's quote, would you be willing to provide some comments from a historical basis on the current conflict or issues with North Korea?
In North Korea? Yeah. Well, the problem with North Korea is that for a variety of reasons, we're in an Orwellian situation where the country with the second largest number of deliverable nuclear weapons, which is us, I think it's 6,900, feels that it's in an existential danger from a country that might have 11 nukes. Now, why is that happening? And it's happening for 2 reasons. We have lost conventional deterrence because over the last 10 years, whether it was the skedaddle from Iraq in 2011, which created ISIS, or it was the fake red lines in Syria, or it was the bombing and going home of Libya, I don't know what that was about, or it was the tough talk about Ukraine and Crimea, or whether it was the 5 deadlines we gave to Iran. I'm not suggesting it was smart or stupid to go into these places. I'm just saying it was very stupid to threaten people without consequences. So North Korea said to itself, they have no deterrence. We're not worried about them. And then secondly, they pose as if they're unhinged. That's a value in nuclear poker. In other words, we're not subject to deterrence because we're so crazy we're willing to eat grass and lose our cities to get Portland or Seattle. And we know that you'll do anything not to lose Portland or Seattle or San Francisco or LA. So we needed missile defense. And if you look what William Perry, the Secretary of Defense, said under Clinton, he said, we could build a very expensive anti-ballistic missile system, but the idea that North Korea would ever threaten us, the continental United States, that's absurd. He said that in the 1990s. Bill Clinton made fun of Star Wars and canceled it. Barack Obama on the hot mic with the outgoing Russian president said, I'll be flexible about missile defense, i.e. I'll cut it if you tell Vladimir to behave until I get elected. So we lost the chance to have missile defense, and we lost the chance that we're capable of anything and anything at any given time. And the result was that China's patron that basically supplies the technology and the capital to North Korea said, go ahead, we enjoy what you're doing. Every once in a while say you're crazy, then threaten the United States, and meanwhile we can go on to our policy of bullying Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. So North Korea is a big asset for China. What do we do about it now that we don't have missile defense and we're not likely to do a preemptive strike? I think we have to really talk about things that are now favorable because they're not nuclear war. If nuclear war is a specter, you want to do anything but that. I would expel every Chinese member of the Communist Party. I would expel him from the United States if he's here. I would expel their children from all U.S. universities. And believe me, if you go to Stanford University, the number of Chinese nationals that are there is quite amazing. And I would suggest that if Japan and South Korea want to go nuclear, that's a decision that they're going to make. And then China would look around and say, wow, do I really want nuclear South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, maybe to join nuclear Russia, nuclear Pakistan on my borders with a nuclear Iran? That's not such a good scenario. So we've got to be creative and think the unthinkable if we don't want to go to war. But China is responsible for it. And finally, all of this talk about Russian collusion, it hasn't proven anything, but it did prove one thing. We lost a valuable Russian card. They have the largest number of deliverable nuclear weapons. They can be very effective in joining us on sanctions and blockades. They can get out of our way in the area. They have an 18-mile border with North Korea. We could have made an argument, do you really want a thermonuclear weapon going off near your border? And yet we've lost all influence with the former Soviet Union and Vladimir Putin. So we've got to work on that because we've got to say, look, you've got to help us with China because you don't want these nuclear countries that are democratic, pro-American, and next to your border having nuclear weapons. So those are the lessons. It's deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. A couple of announcements. First, there will be an afterglow reception with refreshments outside in the lobby down here. And more importantly, Dr. Hanson's book, based on his lecture tonight, The Second World Wars, is due to be released October 17th. This is just an uncorrected proof, so I'm not at liberty to share it. However, it is available for advance purchase, and Dr. Hanson will be signing book plates. And so if you're interested in purchasing a copy, you can have Dr. Hanson sign the book plate, and the book will be sent to you through the mails as soon as it's published. So that will be taking place as well out in the lobby. So we are adjourned. Thank you for being here. Have a good evening.